What's up, A Push? It's Mr. Hill. It's a little late. I had my wife's sister's birthday, and so I didn't get to recording this screencast until pretty late in the game. But here I am, and we're going to talk about the 2020 modified DBQ right now. So let's do it. Let's talk about it. This is our upcoming AP test, and we got to understand what we got to do. So I talked about it a little bit in class today, but just so we can kind of get down to exactly what's expected of us, let's jump into the PowerPoint and let's get to work. Okay, so first of all, what do we have here? Okay, so a breakdown of all of the points right here. Let's see. Why does it keep going back and forth? Here we go. Okay, thesis staying the same. We still are going to do a 2 or 3 main point thesis that, of course, responds to the prompts. With our thesis, we do not have to pick a skill for the DBQ, which is really nice. We practiced picking a skill a lot this year, and now we don't have to do that, but that's okay. That's a good thing. Contextualization, exactly the same. We still have contextualization, 5 to 7 sentences setting the stage. The thesis and your contextualization, of course, will make up your first paragraph. So your first paragraph is the same as always. And then things get a little bit different. They start to break up the evidence points into different ratios. We might remember with the normal DBQ, we have 7 documents. You must describe 3 documents for 1 point, and 6 documents must be used to support your argument for a second point. Now, with this DBQ, they've broken up the documents into several more points. So how they do this, of course, we get 5 documents on this modified DBQ. You have to describe at least 2 of the documents for 1 point. You have to use them, at least 2 of them, to support your argument for an additional point. And to get another point, use at least 4 documents to support your argument. So as we always practice, guys, my best advice for you is to describe all the documents and use all the documents. It only takes a sentence to describe a document. It only takes another sentence, maybe 2, to have that document support your thesis. Therefore, it's not really a time constraint for you guys to have to attempt to use and describe all 5 documents. I think that's a very, very doable thing that all of us can do, regardless of how fast we normally go on these DBQs. And it's a great way to grab some easy points. These points, 1, 2, and 3, we should get these points here because we can describe documents and we can use these documents to support our argument. You'll also notice outside evidence is always part of the DBQ, but notice we have 2 different points for outside evidence. We have uses 1 piece of outside evidence for a point, and then we have uses another piece of outside evidence for a point. Again, these are things that we are very qualified to do, A-Push. We have tons of evidence, tons of proper nouns that we need to use. So we should be grabbing on those points as well. Finally, we have our analysis and reasoning points, 2 of which are happy points. This is actually a nice positive change for us, guys, because there was only 1 happy point on the original DBQ, and you had to happy 3 documents correctly to grab that 1 point. On this modified DBQ, if you do 1 correctly, you get a point, and if you do another 1 correctly, you get a point. So you only have to happy twice correctly to get both of those points there. That's very doable. And then down at the bottom, we have our counter argument. That means that we have 10 total points on this, all of which are things that we have done. The one kind of tricky thing with this, guys, is that we only get 45 minutes to do this. And while they've taken away 2 documents, they have had us now having to do another piece of outside evidence. So time is still going to be a factor on this DBQ for sure. So when we practice this stuff, guys, we're going to go through and make sure that we are doing things to the best of our abilities as far as speed and efficiency. So on that point, what do we do? What exactly is being asked of you guys? First things first, it's the same strategy as any DBQ we do before. You get a prompt, and that prompt must be answered specifically. You need to answer the prompts, guys. The biggest piece of advice I can give us on all of the essays, this is the thing that I tell my A-Push students before they go to the AP test. Every single year I say, guys, you know the material. You know the material better than many of the other students in the country. The only way that you're not going to pass this test is if you misanswer the prompts on one or more of the essay questions. This year, there is only one essay question. It's the entire test. And that means, most importantly, guys, you need to make sure that you answer the prompts exactly as it asks us. What do I mean by that? First of all, what time period is it talking about? If it's talking about 1754 to 1800, take a breath and say, okay, what is this time period? This is the revolutionary time period. 1754, that's the first year of the French and Indian War. 1800, that's the election of Jefferson. You should be able to piece together what's happened in between those two things and say, okay, I know exactly what they're asking me about here. Second thing, if it starts asking, if it has qualifiers in there, if it mentions economic factors, you got to talk about economic factors. Make sure you talk about the economy. Or if it says federal government, actions by the federal government, then don't start talking about state governments, right? It's asking federal government. You have to address the prompt. That's very, very important. Next, you got to outline your documents. We have to outline, guys. It is so important. Yes, the DBQ is always a rush, but you cannot skip the outlining process. The outlining process is so, so important for us to be able to efficiently tackle all points on the DBQ. If you don't outline, you get lost and you forget things. If you do outline, you put on that one piece of paper and you go down the list and you say, what is this document telling me? How is this document providing evidence to answer the prompts? Right here. One, how can this document be used as evidence? Just, jot down a couple things, a couple keywords. Oh, here's a source that I recognize. Here's President Johnson. I could do point of view for this guy. I know this guy. Or, oh, I can do historical evidence for this. Jot that down in your outline. Just show yourself, oh yeah, I could happy this. I know I need to happy twice. Also, here they're talking about the, Nixon administration being unpopular because of interactions in Vietnam, but they don't mention expanding the war to Cambodia. This might be an outside evidence that I can use, right? So as you go through the documents, you just make little notations to yourself. And even though there's only 5 documents, I'm still saying that should take you about 10 to 12 minutes. I know this seems proportionally crazy that this is almost a fourth of your entire essay, but it really is that important, guys. If you outline it well, the whole essay flows into place. Okay, so constructing your thesis. I like to do this with examples. If we had a prompt and the prompt said, evaluate the reasons for a growing mistrust of government from the American people between the years of 1950 and 1980. Okay, so this was like our 2014 DBQ question. And we see a growing mistrust of the government here. And so you look at all of your documents, and I've kind of laid them out for you guys here. Each of the documents are the sources. Let's say source 1 is a private conversation linked on the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Okay. Source 2, New York Times reporting the My Lai conflict. Source 3, transcript of the smoking gun tape, the Watergate scandal. Okay. Source 4, excerpt from the Pentagon Papers. And then source 5, a political cartoon of Vice President Agnew, who was Nixon's vice president, accepting bribes. Okay. First of all, a couple things to point out on this. There's some commonalities. There's certainly 3 things on Vietnam. So Vietnam is going to be one of our buckets for sure. And it looks like the other one is during the Nixon administration. So we can, have 2 different buckets here. We can have one on Nixon and one on Vietnam. I would say, guys, that it's more likely now that you'll probably have 2 buckets, but I don't want to limit you. It's possible that you'll have 3 buckets if there was a source that you just couldn't link to the other sources, a document, if you will, that you couldn't link to the other documents. You're going to have 3 buckets. It's either 2 or 3, obviously, and those buckets are going to make up the main points that you have in your thesis. It's also worth noting, guys, that the College Board has told us that 4 of the documents are going to be what they call text-based, which means they're going to be quotes. But one of the sources they tell us is not going to be text-based, meaning it could be something like source 5, like a political cartoon or a chart or a picture or what have you. So anyways, we look at these sources and we can bucket in two buckets. Bucket one, the US government trying to cover up tyrannical actions in Vietnam. And you can do the Gulf of Tonkin incident, you can do the My Lai conflict, Pentagon Papers you could put in there, and then scandals from the Nixon administration down at the bottom. And of course, that would be source three and source five. So now how do we construct the thesis? Well, of course, with these buckets here, I simply need to plug these buckets into the prompt. It's very simple. Okay, I look at the time period. We need to talk about growing mistrust of government from the American people between 1950 and 1980. I'm going to put my buckets into this thesis, and I'm going to write a thesis that addresses the prompt. Between 1950 and 1980, the American people grew to mistrust their government due to U.S. government covering up tyrannical actions in Vietnam, and because the scandals exposed during the Nixon administration. Aha, I've done that. I know that I'm going to be able to use the documents to back this up because I looked at the documents to form my thesis in the first place, right? So here we go. I've got a thesis that's working for me. What else do I have to do in that intro paragraph? I have to contextualize. Contextualization, 5 to 7 sentences. Most importantly, guys, you are setting the historical stage for your essay. If you are going to start writing an essay on growing mistrust of the American people between 1950 and 1980. Well, maybe if you're going to start talking a lot about Vietnam, then talk about the entry into Vietnam. Talk about why this became such an element of distrust, such an object of discord between the American people and their government, right? That is good contextualization right there. Make sure it's 5 to 7 sentences, and make sure that you use and define two proper nouns. You have to define your proper nouns. So here's my thesis. And since I am discussing Vietnam and the Nixon administration, I want to use contextualization that's going to talk about those things. So here is my intro paragraph. After World War II, France returned to the Southeast Asian country of Vietnam to reclaim their former colony and put down a communist uprising led by leader Ho Chi Minh. Despite U.S. financial backing, France was defeated by the rebels, and Vietnam looked to be becoming a communist state. Yet influenced by the United States, the Geneva Conference split Vietnam into two countries, with South Vietnam being placed under control of a pro-American dictator, Ngo Dinh Diem. Throughout the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, the U.S. increasingly sent in troops to Vietnam, trying to contain communist forces from overcoming the country. As the war became more and more unpopular, Richard Nixon was elected in 1968 while promoting a policy of Vietnamization, or the gradual withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. So what I've done here is I have contextualized on U.S. entry into Vietnam. I've also tied Nixon into this, which is going to then set the stage for my thesis, which of course is in bold here. Between 1950 and 1980, the American people grew to mistrust their government due to the U.S. government covering up tyrannical actions in Vietnam and because of the scandals exposed during the Nixon administration. Boom. Okay, so how do you describe and support documents? It's actually quite simple, and it can be done in just 2 sentences, 2 or 3 sentences, to be able to describe and use each document. Describing a document, guys, is so simple, and it's actually something that sometimes it's so simple we forget to do it. Describing the document just means what is the document? What physically is it, and what is it saying? What's the main idea behind it? And then to have it support your document, to use the document, you simply need to link it to your thesis. So let's do this with an example so you guys have an idea about what I'm talking about. So document 1 is right here. It's the bottom of this slide here. It's a conversation between Lyndon B. Johnson, President Johnson, and Robert McNamara, who's the Secretary of Defense. And it says, regarding the Gulf of Tonkin incident, August 3rd, 1964. So Johnson says, now I wonder if you don't think it'd be wise of you to call a group of 15 to 20 people together from the armed services and foreign relations to tell them what happened. And McNamara says, right, I've been thinking about that myself. And Johnson says, say to Mansfield, they fired at us. We responded immediately and took out one of their boats and took the other 2 running. Now, of course, he didn't know this. Johnson is essentially saying, make up that the North Vietnamese fired first. Now, we have to look at this document through the lens of saying, how is this providing evidence that there was growing mistrust of the American people to their government? And of course, we should be able to describe what this document is saying, To describe this argument, it's so simple, right? To describe it, it's just saying this is a conversation between President LBJ and Secretary of State Robert McNamara on making up a supposed incident in which the North Vietnamese fired upon the American Navy. But to have it linked to your thesis, when you're talking about growing mistrust of the American people to the government, you would simply say when evidence of this conversation got out to the American people, it showed it resulted in a large distrust of the American people and their president, something like that. So as I do here, document one is a conversation between President Johnson and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in which Johnson asked McNamara to report the Gulf of Tonkin incident as an incident where the North Vietnamese fired first. That's describing the document. That's exactly what it is. Notice I am not quoting from the document, guys. You cannot quote. That's a reminder. You cannot quote on any part of your essay. And then I go on to link it to my thesis. When this top secret conversation leaked to the American people, it became obvious that the US government was covering up tyrannical actions in Vietnam, leading to a growing mistrust of the American government. I have described the document. I have had it support my argument. I'm going to do that for all 5 documents, right? But we also have to happy 2 documents. This document is one that we can absolutely happy because we know Johnson, we know a lot about this incident, we learned about it. So how can we explain this doc further? Now, first of all, this is the College Board's words. Why does the historical context, purpose, point of view, or intended audience of the document help explain the document further? Guys, this is the key. Okay, the biggest mistake that we make with happying is that we identify one of these things. We identify the historical context of the document. We identify the purpose of the document. You guys are great at that. The next step, though, is why does that help explain the document further, right? So let me give you some examples of this, okay? So the purpose of this document, right here, the purpose of this document was for the president to come up with an excuse to escalate the conflict in Vietnam. That's totally the purpose of the document. But you can't just say this is the purpose of the document. You also have to put the why. Why does this help explain the document further? So then in bold, which is the why, President Johnson is saying to Secretary McNamara because he's hoping to get permission from Congress to wage war in Vietnam. That's why he's saying it. That's why it helps explain this document further, right? So you have to show some historical knowledge there and some analytical skills to show the why. Same situation here. The point of view of this document was President Lyndon Johnson to his Secretary of Defense. President Johnson was a believer in domino theory and believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Asia would too. Thus, he pushed McNamara to say the North Vietnamese fired first. There's the why there in bold. The historical context of this document is that President Kennedy had just ordered the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem, and South Vietnam was very unstable when President Johnson took office. Thus, Johnson was motivated to convince Congress to allow him to take action in Vietnam. There's the why right there. And finally, the intended audience of this document was just the 2 men in the conversation. So yeah, this is a top secret conversation. So who's the intended audience? Obviously, it's not the American people. It's just these 2 people, Johnson and McNamara. So how does that help explain the document? This was intended to be a top secret conversation, and thus it reveals that Johnson told McNamara to fabricate a story that the North Vietnamese fired first. The happy. We only have to happy 2 documents. Now, guys, as far as speed is concerned, this is where my advice for you guys depends on you as a writer. If you are someone who is very, very quicker in writing these DBQs, then you can afford to happy 3 documents. If you are someone that is a little bit slower, you could do 2. You could do 2 and be thorough with 2. It also depends on the documents. There's some documents that are just easier to happy than others. And if you see 3 documents that you can happy, go ahead and happy 3 documents, guys. Obviously, time is the consideration on this. Because of the breakdown now, where it's not all or nothing. On the normal DBQ, it's you either happy 3 correctly and get the point, or you happy less than that and you don't get the point. Now, if you happy 1 correctly, you get a point. You happy a second one correctly, you get a second point. Thus, it's not the end of the world if you only happy two and you mess up on one. I guess my point is, guys, is that I want you to happy at least two. If you have the time, happy three, but you need to happy at least two. Go for it. Let's go for that perfect score. Okay, outside evidence. First of all, as we go through the essay, just on a worldly picture, right? The first paragraph, and let me start by saying too, this is going to be a 4 or 5 paragraph essay, right? You got your intro paragraph. Depending on your buckets, you're going to have 2 or 3 body paragraphs. If you have 2 buckets, like I have in this essay, you're going to have 2 body paragraphs. But if you have 3 buckets, you're going to have 3 body paragraphs. And then, of course, you'll have your counter argument as your final paragraph. But in these body paragraphs is where you're going to have your outside evidence. Your outside evidence is going to appear after you describe and use a document. If you happy a document, then it will go after the happy. If you don't happy the document, then it will just go after your description and use of the document. So that's what I'm saying here. You need 2 pieces of outside evidence in this essay. You don't need 1 anymore, you need 2. Just go in the body paragraphs after your description and use of the document or after you happy the document. We know how to do outside evidence, guys. This is something that we've practiced a million times because we've practiced a million SAQs. You simply have to add a proper noun not mentioned in the documents, define or describe that proper noun, and then link it to your thesis. If we are talking about the very, very same document that we've been talking about with this Gulf of Tonkin incident, then a great piece of outside evidence would be the Tonkin Gulf resolution. That's so simple, and it's a proper noun not used in the document that you guys are all aware of and can be an easy way to link to growing mistrust of the American people. So this is how it would look. This is me describing and using the document one more time. Document 1 is a conversation between President Johnson and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in which Johnson asked McNamara to report the Gulf of Tonkin as an incident where the North Vietnamese fired first. When this top secret conversation leaked to the American people, it became obvious that the U.S. government was trying to cover up tyrannical actions in Vietnam, leading to a growing distrust of the American government. Then I say, a piece of evidence not mentioned in the documents. That sentence starter, guys, is so important because you're showing the reader, hey, here I am, I'm using a piece of outside evidence. I'm showing you this isn't historical context, this isn't anything else, this is me getting my outside evidence points. You say, not mentioned in the documents is the Tonkin Gulf incident above led to Congress passing the Tonkin Gulf resolution. This new law gave President Johnson unrestricted powers to wage war in Vietnam. As this new law was based on a fabricated incident, this lie was immensely damaging in the eyes of the American people, once again tying it to the thesis, which is on growing mistrust of the American people. There's my outside evidence there. You guys are going to have a million pieces of outside evidence to use. You just insert them into those body paragraphs. And then last but not least, your final paragraph, which is your counter argument. Remember, your counter argument paragraph is the only thing you need in that last and final paragraph. And you're basically saying, can I argue the other side of my main argument? This one was very black and white, and I actually found this one kind of tricky to do a counter argument for because, it says, I need to show the other side of the argument, but this argument was very, very black and white. I mean, I just spent my whole essay arguing that the U.S. government covered up actions in Vietnam and the scandalous Nixon administration led to a growing mistrust of the U.S. government. I mean, that's pretty black and white. There's not much of a counter argument to that. But there's 2 ways you could do a counter argument. One which would be, one down here, an example of the U.S. attempting to cover up actions in Vietnam or the Nixon administration led to more trust in the U.S. government. Now, that would be a tough one to argue, although one thing I thought about is I could say that the Nixon administration actually led to more trust in the U.S. government with African Americans because Nixon expanded affirmative action. And I could have argued that, but it just didn't seem like the strongest argument for me. So I opted to do the second way that I can do a counter argument was a more important reason Americans began to mistrust their government in this time period. And I did the economy and stagflation of the 70s. So I wrote a counter argument to the assertion that tyrannical actions in Vietnam and the scandalous Nixon administration led to the growing mistrust of the government by the American people would be that a far bigger reason for growing mistrust would be the tremendous stagflation of the American economy in the 1970s. Stagflation is the economic condition in which the economy stagnates or slows, and inflation rises dramatically. Following World War II, the U.S. economy was the strongest in the world, and Americans enjoyed the highest standard of living. However, when President Johnson insisted upon fighting the war in Vietnam and increasing spending for his Great Society programs without raising taxes, the American economy was doomed to fall into a long looming recession. The recession, more than the actions in Vietnam or scandals, led to a growing mistrust of the American government. So that is my counter argument. I argued that more important than the actions in Vietnam, more important than the Nixon administration scandals, was just the fact that the economy fell and people lost faith in their leaders, which often happens in recessions. Okay, guys, so this is our modified DBQ. One more time, what we're looking at, guys, is the same exact stuff we've always covered. We just have different ratios of what we need to do. First paragraph is exactly the same, contextualization thesis. Your last paragraph is exactly the same, the counter argument. All we got to do now is describe and use all our documents correctly, and then happy well twice, and use 2 pieces of outside evidence. That is what this AP test is all about, and we are going to crush it, guys. I'm very confident. We're going to practice this for 7 weeks, and you guys are going to be masters of the modified DBQ. I'm excited. Hope you guys are too. See you guys soon. Ace that DBQ little mini quiz on Schoology right now.